My name is Art McDonald. Just quickly, for those of you who might not be aware, we're working on a history project. Can't hear? Is that true? A little louder? Yeah. Great. So we're working on a history project for the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. And we're getting close to completion, just to let you know there's the... So it is real, it's not just a rumor. We first met Tony, my wife and I, Melanie, through National Catholic Reporter, America Magazine, as we read the story in these last years of Tony's challenges with the CDF group in the Catholic Church, and we heard about this Irish priest who was silenced for his speaking and preaching and writings on so many issues, particularly in a magazine, I think, called Reality, which is a Redemptorist publication. Tony's a Redemptorist priest, and he had this monthly column in which he articulated views not unlike APP views over the years. So we thought to ourselves, we have to track this fellow down. We go to Ireland every other year, roughly, and so we got a hold of his email and sent him an email. He immediately responded. We said we were coming to the west of Ireland, and he said he was living in Athenry. And we happened to rent a bungalow in Athenry every 2 years. So it was an easy connection. We spent a beautiful evening with Tony, getting to know him and hearing his story. And through the pain of telling that story, we also sense this, if you will, and I don't know if Tony would agree with this, a certain liberation through this silencing. So it was a very interesting encounter. This unjust system that silenced this great preacher and teacher gave him an opportunity to do other things and liberate him in some ways. So he talked about how he Skypes every other day with this international group of people that have formed a group, I think, called Church Reform Network. And Tony travels around meeting with folks across the world talking about the future church. Tony is also responsible with other Irish priests for the initiation of a group called the Association of Catholic Priests in Ireland, formed in 2010. And he met our own Bernie Serval not long after that. Bernie traveled off to Ireland to find out what this group was all about, because Bernie had a similar idea. And as you all, or many of you know, Bernie and others started a National Association of Catholic Priests in the United States in 2011. So we're all somewhat connected. So I just want to leave you words with the former president of Ireland, Mary McAleese, about Tony. She started this introduction of Tony by citing some words from John the 23rd in 1962 as the council was initiated. And Mary says, Tony Flannery's heart was set aglow with a passion for the gospel and for the church. And 2 years after the famous opening of the Vatican Council, at the age of 17, he joined the Redemptorist order, dedicating his life to the priesthood and to the people of God. He will soon celebrate the 40th anniversary of his ordination. This was probably 5 years ago, to the priesthood, and what a priesthood it has been. A deeply empathetic and listening pastor, a preacher and teacher par excellence, a loving but scrupulously faithful critic of his fallible and at times failing church, a man of faith and courage, unafraid to be a voice of contradiction, to turn his back on the crowd and lead in the direction he conscientiously believes the Lord is calling him. We are blessed to have Tony with us
tonight. I'll try this microphone and see if it's okay. You know, they probably heard the old yarn about the priest beginning Mass, and he blessed himself and he wasn't sure the microphone was working. So he said, there's something wrong with this microphone. And the people all answered, and also with you. That joke doesn't work anymore because it's awful and with your spirit. I would gather it's loud enough, is it? Yeah. Now, you just have to put up with my West of Ireland accent because I can't change that. 72 years ago. And don't believe a word that said, and even less so what Mary McAleese wrote. I'm nothing of that. But anyway, it was nice that people said those things. That book that I bought a few copies with me is just an account of my dealings with the Vatican. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to talk about something I know nothing about, which is God. But anyway, but there's a few copies of that available. It all happened in 2012, and the first person, the head of the CDF, when I became aware that they had focused on me, of course, had to be a bloody American. William Levada, or Levada, or however you pronounce his name. And then halfway through the year, he retired and he was replaced by Gerhard Müller. Apologies to any Germans here. The interesting thing, the big issue I had with it was the process. And I won't go into any detail about that, but whenever I talk about it, I talk about the unjust process. And you know what I got an enormous kick out of? When Francis sacked Müller. Now, strictly he didn't sack him. What he did was, he didn't reappoint him after the 5 years. What did Müller say? He complained about the lack of due process. He said, well, bloody well good enough for you. So there you go. I'm a Redemptorist, and I spent my life as a priest going around preaching missions and retreats and novenas and all that sort of stuff up to 2012. And the Redemptorists came to Ireland in the middle of the 19th century. And they became known as the Hellfire Preachers. And the generation before me now, I was ordained shortly after the council, so things had begun to change. But before that, for a whole century, the Redemptorists had a set theme for a week of a parish mission, and a set theme for each night. And there was what was known as the Blue Book. And the Blue Book had a text of the sermon for each night. Hard to imagine it now, but that's the way it was. Now, the preacher was allowed to deviate in the sense that he could use his own illustrations and examples, but he had to stick basically to the content of the set text. The opening night of the mission, the title of the sermon was The Three Last Things. I presume you all know what the three last things are. You don't? God help us. You'll find out. The three last things: death, judgment,
and heaven.
Heaven or hell forever. The openings, I just for the fun of it as much as anything else, to relax myself, because as I say, I'm going to talk then about something I know nothing about, and that's not easy. The opening sentence of that sermon. Now, you'd have to imagine that in those times, mostly there weren't any microphones, and there was a pulpit in most churches. So the preacher would be up in the pulpit, and the Redemptorists have it. I think there were Redemptorists here, so you might remember it. Black, with a cincture, the 15 decades of the rosary beads, collar with a split down the front. And the preacher would also have quite a large crucifix hanging off his neck, down his front, with the end of it tucked in under his cincher. And then, of course, he had a beretta. Do you remember the beretta?
Yes.
You're all as old as my son. So he'd be an impressive figure up in that pulpit. And he'd be speaking very loud because he hadn't a microphone. And he always began with a quotation. And for the quotations was from Scripture. He wouldn't put the beretta on him. He'd be holding the beretta here at his chest. So, this is how he began. It is appointed unto man but once to die, and after death, the judgment. My dear brethren, in Jesus Christ. As he placed the beretta on his head. As I gaze down tonight at your upturned faces, I know not your name or your age. I know not if you are rich or poor, strong or weak. But there is one truth that I know about each and every one of you, one great eternal truth, that each and every one of you will one day die. So that's how the traditional redemption song began, and it went on from there. No wonder we were known as the hellfire preachers. But as I say, in the generation I lived through, we actually in Ireland went from one, you could almost say one extreme to the other. We became the really liberal group in the Irish church. So anyway, that's it. Since I am no longer ministering as a priest, and while I'm still a full member of the Redemptorist congregation, and they're very supportive of me, to be fair, I decided that rather than stay in the monastery where I was very involved in all the ministry that was going on there, that when I couldn't participate in it anymore, I found it difficult. So I moved out of the monastery. As it happened, a few miles away, my old family home was vacant. Parents were dead, my siblings were in different parts of the country, but we had kept the home. And I moved back there, and I'm living there since, and it's good. And Art mentioned a certain sense of liberation, and he's right, in the sense that I have begun to think differently about a lot of things. And if I was invited back into the priesthood, now I don't think I'd want to go for starters, but even if I did, I certainly wouldn't preach most of what I spend my life preaching, because my thinking has changed greatly. And to some of that, I want to see, can I tease out a little bit with you tonight, and maybe to set your thinking rather than anything else. And probably some of you are much more advanced in thinking about these things than I am myself. I begin with a quote from C.S.R. We might as well start at a very high level. I came across this recently. I hadn't known that he had said this, and I'm amazed. C.S.R. died in 1955, well before the council. And he said this: "It has sometimes seemed to me that there are 3 weak stones settled dangerously in the foundations of the modern church." And then he lists them. First, a government that excludes democracy. Now imagine 1955. Second, a priesthood that minimizes women. Again 1955. And third, a revelation that excludes further prophecy. A revelation that excludes further prophecy. Now that's the one I want to talk a bit about tonight. I mean, we know he was a genius, but like, whenever he said that, about 70 years ago at least, and now all three of them are major issues in the church. Now we know we have other issues like the clerical sex abuse and all that sort of thing, and you know as much about that as I do, because basically you here and we in Ireland have been through the same experiences. But I think that C.S.R. one, the revelation that excludes future prophecy, is actually going to become the major issue for the Catholic Church, and the one that will decide ultimately whether the Church has a future. And for me at this stage, that's a real question, because I think the challenge is going to be enormous. I'll quote a bit from Irish writers on the topic. I know you have your own here in America, and I know that I never quite know how to pronounce her name. Delio or Delio? Delio. And you had her here a few years ago. And a lot of what I'll be saying will be similar enough to what she says, but as I say, I'll be quoting. In particular, two Irish writers, a man called John Feehan. Now, you'd never have heard of John Feehan because I'm not aware that he's known much outside of Ireland. John is an ecologist, a layman, but he is also a theologian. And he is writing some marvelous stuff on this whole area nowadays. So he's one I quote from. And the second one is a guy called Diarmid O'Murrochú. Now get your tongue around that one. Some of you are familiar with it. Now, actually in English it's Dermot Murphy. Diarmid O'Murrochú is the Irish version, but he goes by that. And he's writing incredible. I can't understand how Diarmid O'Murrochú hasn't been silenced, because he's 1,000 times more radical than anything I ever saw, and he still goes strong. Incidentally, I mean, this is beside the point. The papal nuncio in Ireland, all through, he's gone now, we banished him to Albania. Another American from New York, Charles Brown. He was papal nuncio through all that time that I had met him. A very correct man, beautifully dressed in the best of clerical attire. And on one occasion, he was being interviewed on our national radio, RTE, and the interviewer challenged him about the silencing of Tony Flannery, to which Charles Brown replied, "Silencing? Every time I turn on the radio, he's on it." So at least it's good. John Feehan, there's a quote. "In theology, we're held fast in a formulation of what incarnation means that was welded together to still the speculative theological turmoil that was rife in 325 AD. Even though that formulation is steeped in a child's grasp of what creation means." This morning, for my 2 nights here, I'm staying with Reggie and enjoying his hospitality. And this morning, I sat down in the church for the celebration of the Mass. And they had the card there with the text of the Mass, and I picked it up, and I was looking through the text of the Creed. I find it fascinating, after a lifetime spent up there at the altar leading it, to be now, as I've been for the last 6 years, down the church, observing. I know you shouldn't be observing at the Mass, but inevitably at times we do. I believe in God the Father Almighty, and you know it better in Latin. Credo in unum Deum, Patrum omnipotentem, factorum celestium terra. Do you remember that anyway? I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in his Son Jesus Christ. How's this all got? Only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before time began, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, consubstantial with the Father, from whom all things were made. And you know where all that came from? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And as John Feehan said, even though the formulation is steeped in a child's grasp of what creation means. And that's the issue. And this is where the problem is going to be. I'll give you another quote, this time from an English, a Church of England theologian of the last century called Charles Raven. This is the way it goes. We as human creatures, limited by our status, cannot speak with knowledge of what transcends our experience. We may lay down certain propositions about the nature of the Godhead. We may support them by inference and analogy, but, and this is the real key of it, but it is sinful pride and great foolishness to talk as if we could define the infinite or formulate absolute truth. We must beware of claiming for our words an ultimate wisdom and inerrant authority. In other words, what he's saying is that the people who defined the nature of God, as we have it in the Creed, in 325 AD, with a very imperfect knowledge, even less so than us, and none of us can claim to be able to understand the infinite. What he says about them is sinful pride and great foolishness. And we're stuck with it, because it is now at the core of Catholic dogma. And what do we do with it? Okay. In 325 AD, they thought the world was flat, and they thought the earth was the center of the universe, and the sun was revolving around us. They thought that creation happened in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested, and the best estimate they had of the time that it happened was about 3,000 years before that. Okay, so that's what they were working on. So they introduced the story of the Garden of Eden and the sin of Adam and Eve. Now, whether the original writers of that story wrote it as a metaphor or an analogy or a myth, by 325 AD it had become reality, historical fact. Now we know that creation, that the universe began, insofar as we can know anything about it, 13.7 billion years ago. And that human beings are on the earth somewhere between 150,000 years and 4 million years. And just think of that in the context of one of our, again, core Catholic doctrines, that after the sin of our first parents, God closed the gate of heaven against humanity. And it wasn't reopened until his son Jesus came down and died a horrible death on the cross to appease the anger of God. Okay? Now, while that might have made some little bit of sense, though really very little, if you thought that only a couple of thousand years had passed, consider all the millions and billions and billions of people who lived either 150,000 or 4 million years before Jesus came. and God closed the gate of heaven against every one of them. That's inconceivable. Not only inconceivable, it's utterly preposterous. It makes no sense. If we at the same time believe, as we do, that God is a loving, gracious Father. So where does that leave another one of the core Christian doctrines, Catholic doctrines, that Jesus came to open the gates of heaven and to save humanity? So you see what I mean when I say that with our new understanding, the challenge to what we would have regarded as basic Christian doctrine is going to be enormous. And I said to myself, what's the chances of church leadership and church structures of authority as we have them now coming to grips with all of this and beginning to redefine it? See the kerfuffle that's going on over whether or not divorced-only married people could go to communion. It's close enough to causing a schism in the church. Imagine some of the stuff I'm talking about here. And she's videoing it and it's going to go up on YouTube. John Feehan and lots of others who are writing about this now. There's two great guys in Australia that you might be familiar with too. Michael Morwood is one, and there's a guy called Kevin Preston. I don't know how well known he would be over here. He's a layman in Australia, and he has written a book called Who Do You Say That I Am? Marvelous book on this whole topic also. But what's beginning to happen now in science, as we discover more about the extraordinary extent of the universe on the one hand, and the incredible, intricate minutiae of the universe. What's beginning to happen, even among some scientists, is they're beginning to think, this didn't just happen and continue to exist by accident. Like each one of us, for instance, is made up by millions and billions of little particles constantly working together. And the thing that they emphasize about it now is the cooperation that goes on at this minute level in nature to keep us in existence. And not just to keep us in existence, but to keep the whole of creation in existence. As one of the Feehan said at a lecture I was at recently, he said even the simplest of flowers of nature, and the one he picked, now I know nothing about this, but this was the one he picked, the leaf or the flower of a magnolia tree, he said is one of the least complex. But he said even that shares basically the same structure as me and you. The complexity of human nature is extraordinary. And as we're learning all of this, if I get a quote here now, just for a minute, I got all the quotes. Yeah, again, this is Feehan. The more deeply we understand the workings of the universe, in particular the living world, and especially the human mind and spirit, denial of an ultimate purpose appears even more hollow and trivial. See what he's saying there? Denial of an ultimate purpose. In other words, the more we're learning about the extraordinary mystery of the universe, the more people are realizing there is some ultimate purpose at work here. So, from a Christian point of view, and the writers that I've been mentioning, what they're saying is that the God that we believed in, the God that me and my ancestors preached about, the God up in the sky, sitting in his throne in heaven, he's not there at all. In fact, heaven isn't there. But the divine presence, and I like to use the phrase divine presence rather than God because of all the old connotations that God carries, the word God carries, that the divine presence is actually at the heart of creation. And that creation is not a historical event. Creation is a constant reality, continuing from day to day and year to year and from aeon to aeon. So you see, that's a very different notion of the God, of the divine. And they go from that to say that that divine presence, that is the spirit that is guiding, that is the ultimate purpose of the whole of creation, that divine presence is in you and in me and in the magnolia flower and in everything that exists. It's a beautiful notion. And the divine presence at the heart of creation is driven by what? It's driven by ultimate love. So that gets us back, you see, to the basic Christian message that Jesus of Nazareth came to tell us about. He used the language of his time because he was a man of his time, and he used the images of his time. But what he said about the Father and the relationship that he had with his Father fits perfectly into, I think, this new understanding of the divine presence as a reality not up in the sky, not apart from us, but right with us and in us. And I'm not talking here, one of the big disputes that was going on at the time of the Nicene Creed and all of that was this notion of pantheism, that everything is God. They're not saying that. They're saying instead that God is in everything, that God is working through everything. I have one lovely quote here from something of God materializes in every species. Creation is, at its most fundamental, about God's own self-fulfillment in being. In other words, that what God is doing in creation is fulfilling himself or herself or itself or whatever you'd like to call it. Creation is the garden God walks in, and we are invited to walk with him. And if you put that in the context of the whole climate change and all the challenges faced in that, isn't this a wonderful theology for dealing with that? My old friend Omar Aku, he says, science was fully subservient to religion during the whole history of humanity up to the 18th century. Because religion was the dominant thing all through that period, from the early years of Christianity, when it became the official religion under Constantine, and religion was the dominant belief. And any scientific discovery, as Galileo found out, unless it fitted into religious belief, it was rejected. But that changed in the 18th century. The 18th century was the era of Newton, of Descartes, of Pascal, all believers, but all of them brilliant. New thinking about creation and about humanity. And what happened in the 18th century, and was really came to its fulfillment in an awful way, you could say, in the French Revolution, was the importance of reason. That now reason became more important than religious belief. And the reaction of the church at that time, and coming right on to our own time, was to reject science. So the conflict was there between religion and science, which was a tragedy. It was a tragedy on both sides, but it was a particular tragedy for the church, because it rejected so much that was so important to be heard and to be listened to. I'm getting near my end, and I hope I haven't you totally confused, because I have myself totally gone. The more I think about this, I say, oh my God. Einstein was an atheist. You all heard of Einstein. You have Albert Einstein. He actually died the same year that Charlotte died, 1955. This quote from Einstein: "To be aware that behind all we experience, something is hidden, and that our intellect is unable to grasp that something." Now, this is really interesting from Einstein, the atheist. That our intellect is unable to grasp that something. Something of which the beauty and the majesty come to us only imperfectly and as a feeble appearance. To be aware of that something is true religiosity. From Einstein. And he says, in that sense, I am a deeply religious atheist. I think we have a key there. Put that with the new understanding of the divine presence in creation. That's our way of describing, or not describing because you can't describe it, but of trying to in some way get in touch with the notion of the divine presence. And are we saying anything different to what Einstein is saying? Not really. As long as both of us, church and scientists, and I think increasingly we will, realize that we're dealing with profound mystery. We go back to what Charles Raven said in the quote I gave earlier in the talk. It is foolishness and great arrogance to try to define the mystery that's at the heart of it all. So that's a big challenge for the church. And I don't know how it will go, but I do know this, that unless the church can be open to the discoveries and the understandings of science, and be willing to listen to them, and to engage with them, and to dialogue with them, people increasingly will, as they are doing now, reject Catholic teaching. But I get up a poem, and this is, I'm finishing with this, because you see, the sort of understanding of God that we're talking about now, this is not new really, because for one thing, poets had it a long time ago. And I'm reading here from Gerald Manley Hopkins. Now, Gerald Manley Hopkins is notoriously difficult to read because he uses language in all sorts of ways, and I'll probably make a mess of it. It's quite a short poem. It's called God's Grandeur. I'll have a go at it. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights of the black west wind or morning at the brown brisk eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and bright wings. That's a good way to finish. Because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and bright wings. Thank you very much.
Sitting by some upper region of the Shannon, and you were trying to think about what is going on in ourselves when we try to grasp what we're doing when we receive the host in the Eucharist.
Explain it a bit more, because I don't quite understand what you're getting at. What's the connection between Shannon and the Eucharist?
Just to situate that you're some real spot with your feet in the water and you're not on some cloud. How would you start to wrestle with it?
To wrestle with what I receive when I receive the Eucharist.
Yeah. So you're wrestling with sacrament. So.
Absolutely. Yes. And wrestling is the word as far as I'm concerned right now. I know that I've experienced it occasionally during my life, and how many thousand masses did I say? I have no idea. I know that occasionally I have experienced something very profound that I could not possibly even begin to explain, but I just knew. Beyond that, I don't know what I'd say. What would you say? One second, just 1 second. We'll come to you in a minute.
It's part of this.
Okay, come on.
In Teilhard, and certainly in Ilia de Leo, she talks about a Christ consciousness. And this Christ consciousness is really permeating every part of creation. Any kind of food we eat, the sky, the clouds. And Jesus, in some ways, could have chosen anything to say, I am going to be present there, because the Christ consciousness is present in every single thing. And so, to say the bread and the wine, yes, the consciousness is there in the bread and the wine. But it also could have been Pepsi Cola and something else, because the Christ consciousness is there too. I don't think like when I read the material, it just seems so astounding as to far as really what's going on here. That this presence, we call divine presence, whatever it is permeated every single part of this material creation and other dimensions that we are not yet in touch with. And that permeation is so deep and so real. And we talk about a purpose. It's moving toward the fulfillment that love permeates and comes out everywhere. you know, in the little flower, in the dog, in the alligator, in us. And we're the prime, we're supposed to be the prime source of that, some immensity of showing out this kind of a presence and actually becoming then love fulfilled.
Yeah. Can I just ask you then, is there something particularly different about the presence in the Eucharist than the Christ presence in everything, from your understanding?
I don't think so. I really don't. I think Jesus chose the bread and the wine because it was there. And in some ways, bread has been associated culturally with the idea of the staff of life, and wine with its exuberance and wonder. And so that would be why, you know, and how many people have bread and wine at their meals every night kind of thing. So I think he used the bread and the wine to sort of enunciate, yes, I'm present there. Could we have understood, you know, sitting around that table 2,000 years ago what he was talking about? I don't think so. But if somehow we put ourselves in this frame that Chardin is talking about, and many others, your Irish friends and the Australian, and this is coming, these ideas are coming from so many different sources that I think some kind of consciousness is breaking through to us now that we just haven't had before. And sacramentation is all over.
I'd suggest to take that just even a slight step further, but on the same line. He didn't take grapes and wheat. He took bread and wine that had been changed by people. And that, I think that's what you were talking about our share, the continued process of what we are going through. Our work is that creation going forward.
Yeah.
Well, the Christ consciousness of which you were speaking, when I look at, for instance, the man that went to the synagogue and killed 11 people, when I look at the man that's now the fake president of this country, and I say fake because he says fake news, I say he's the fake president. Okay, when I look at that, I can't see Christ consciousness. And then I look at Buddhism that makes no distinction from what I know of evil and good. This all has its place in this vast experience. So I can't see Christ consciousness in that man as president at all. Nothing. I see nothing good in him whatsoever. Nothing. Now, if you can convince, but so I see it as somehow the embodiment of ugliness that's come out of the social experience in this country. The stupidity, racism, and so many other things, and white supremacy that sees itself threatened, that out of that cauldron comes this denial of anything of love. So I can't see any Christ consciousness in him, or what grabbed that man to drive from Baldwin, Pennsylvania, where I used to live and work, Baldwin, to that synagogue and murder 11 people.
Thanks. And I'm very conscious that in what I said, I very deliberately stayed off the whole problem of evil. Because no matter what way we look at it, the problem of evil remains. And sorry.
On another note.
Wait a minute. Do you want the microphone?
No, I don't need it.
Oh, yes, you do.
Would you be able to share your thoughts with us on women's ordination? What conclusions have you come to?
What conclusion would I come to?
Yes, on women's ordination. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's one of the reasons I'm in the situation I'm in. And I suppose I would phrase it very differently now to what I say about 8 years, whatever years ago, when the Vatican objected. Because I wouldn't simply call for women's ordination now, because I think the whole thing of priesthood needs to be redesigned.
Yes.
As I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think that what you were attempting to describe to us, which cannot be described, is the experience of God, and that is such a personal experience. But when we were all taught and educated about God, we were just given all of these rules and regulations about God and what God could or couldn't do, or what we could or couldn't do. And so it seems like until we get to re-educate or educate the children differently about God, which some people do, but it's hard, I think, for generations that have accepted that more primitive explanation of who we are and Adam and Eve and all of that, until we can ourselves get down to the level of a child again, so that we can teach them what we are maybe now experiencing. And maybe can children experience the God that we are now experiencing, some of us are now experiencing.
One of the things I'm conscious of, one of the things I spent a lot of my life doing were novenas to the Mother of Perpetual Help. It's a big redemptorist thing, and a big part of it is inviting people to write out petitions. Dear Mother of Perpetual Help, my daughter is sick, and would you pray to God for her that he might heal her? Now, that's totally the notion of the God in the sky sitting on his throne who needs his mother to go and persuade her. I mean, I couldn't do that again.
As I was listening to this gentleman talk about evil, and I kind of believe that that's all part of the process. That's all part of the journey of church, is wondering and trying to define what the divine presence is. That's the relationship, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think that oftentimes we talk about our experience in prayer as with God as a one-to-one, and in some ways it is, but it doesn't, to me, does not really have value until it brings in others. And I try to, and I struggle with that. And I was wondering too, when you were talking about the Nicene Creed, the issue I always had with it was how Mary is portrayed there. You know, that Mary had to be a virgin. And that, I once said to, there was a priest at our parish, Monsignor McCarran, who was the head of Catholic Charities in the city of Pittsburgh, in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And I said to him one time, it was around Easter time and on Good Friday when you do all these praying and you pray for the virgins. And I said, what about us non-virgins? There wouldn't be any virgins if there wasn't any I just feel like there's been walls built to stop us from having a personal relationship like with Mary. You put, and like you were saying about God being up here, when really God's down here, you know. And I think that one of the things that the Catholic Church has done is it become an exclusive club. And unless you follow the rules, like you would join an exclusive club, like the Bourbons or the Italians, or if you don't follow those rules, then you're not accepted. And I think that that's not at all what the message of God is, or Jesus. The message is that we all should be doing these questions. I was blessed because I had a mother who said to me, question your faith. That's how it grows and how it strengthens.
Good. She's coming around. Anybody else want to just say it?
Do you think that in ancient times, religion was created to organize people? Before the beginning and evolution of societies and the evolution of science, religion was a tool to pull people together and create rules to establish civility and establish society that hadn't yet evolved.
That's an interesting question. There is another writer who has only written in German. He's a Jesuit. He's about 95 or something now. Lenaers is his name, Lenaers. But his books are generally not available in English. But he would say that Jesus never wanted a religion, and that it only became a religion in the 3rd century with Constantine and all of that, and that's where all the rules and regulations came in. What Jesus wanted was people to love each other, love God and love each other, and in that way to build up the kingdom of God. That was the total focus. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I mean, gee, that's about as radical a statement as you could imagine. That we have to abolish the whole notion of a religion.
Would you say something more about the concept of original sin?
What?
Would you say something more about the concept of original sin?
Well, now, anything I'd say is not ex cathedra or anything like that. Like
I mean, where, you know, how you talked about... Yes.
Yeah. You see, it doesn't make sense to me that that whole notion of original sin was built around Jesus as the Savior coming to open the gates of heaven. And then baptism was our way of getting into this new life that would lead us to heaven. And none of that makes sense to me anymore. So I'm going back to Matthew Fox and the original blessing, that we're born into love, not into sin.
Right. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Just give her a minute, she's coming with the microphone. They're doing well there.
When I pass away and I die, where am I going, or who am I going to see?
You really don't expect me. Which is interesting. Then, on the stuff I'm reading now, particularly on Moricu's latest book, which is called Incarnation, you see, he deals with the whole thing of the resurrection of Jesus. And he basically dismisses the bodily resurrection, but that the divine presence, that Jesus was the ultimate self-fulfillment of the divine presence, you know, in the sense that he was the one who had this link to the divinity most closely in his humanity, and that when he died, he just became part of the divine presence permeating the whole of the universe, and that too is the same destiny for all of us. And then he leaves the question, because he doesn't attempt to answer it. Do we become part of this divine presence as individuals? Meaning that we would continue to have a relationship with the people we loved in this world, and I certainly hope we do. But when you die before me, come back and tell me. That's the best I think.
If God knows my plan and knows the path of life that I'm going to go on, how does the factor of free will play into my life, and how do I know that I'm fulfilling God's will when I am given the option of free will?
Well, you see, now, again, I mean, I'm only attempting my answer to it. And I would see the notion of God knowing everything and knowing how your life is going to plan out is part of the God in the sky. That our ultimate task in this world is to link into the presence of God, and we do that through love and loving. And your future in this life and in the next will depend on how much you learn to love. And God and nobody else knows that. But it's in your hands. The only thing is, the divine presence is also in you, calling you every day to love more.
I'm an Einsteintinian.
You're a what? An Einsteintinian?
A follower of Einstein.
Okay, good. So you know an awful lot more about Einstein than I do.
Listening to you and the plea for a dialogue between religion and science makes me think of modern science and quantum theory and all that, and it seems to me that a key aspect is a recognition of the uncertainty of the universe. And to that extent, the God in the sky idea seems to me based on a quest for certainty.
Based on?
A quest for certainty.
Yes.
You know, that this is certain, and here are all the rules, and you just follow this. And it seems like you're counterposing to that sort of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that prophecy has to continue. You know, that we can't, everything can't have been told to us. So that was the one observation. I had a question. You may not...
Just before you get on to your question, would it be fair, would you agree or disagree with me, if I use the word mystery where you use the word uncertainty?
Better. Mystery is
okay,
better.
Okay, go ahead, yeah, so we're on the same page. Yeah, go on.
You said that you said Mass thousands of times, but a couple of times you felt this profound presence or something.
Yeah.
And I want to know if you would be willing to share with us a little bit more about that. And you may not be able to at once, but I'm curious.
That again is where we're entering the world of mystery.
Yeah.
And I just, it was always in the context of a large group of people, well, a group of people who had, among whom there was a real sense of something that we all share deeply together. That was a sort of essential requirement for it to happen. Like, for instance, as a priest, I worked a bit in England, and I'd often enough, say, do weddings for people who, maybe one of them was a nominal Catholic and the other one wasn't, whatever. And most of the people in the church hadn't a clue, but they still wanted a Mass. Now, I wouldn't experience much of that Mass, either for myself or for anybody else. Beyond that, you see, what do you say? You just know. I just know that there was something happening there that was good.
As we begin to